All right, we are back. What is going on, Colts Nation? We are finally through 3 days of the NFL draft. It has been a fun and long and grueling process. I know for us, Derek, we are exhausted. We are wiped. But before we go and crash, we wanted to bring you guys a recap from the 2024 NFL draft for the Indianapolis Colts. So we are going to review, discuss each and every pick for the Indianapolis Colts. Colts had a bunch of picks here in this draft. Obviously, they had picks in the first 4 rounds. They had 3 fifth-round picks, a 6th, and a 7th. So definitely a lot of different options for the Colts in this draft. So we're going to talk about that. But before we do, just want to let you guys know that this episode is presented by PrizePicks. So be sure to visit prizepicks.com or use their app. And when you sign up, use the code BTJ for a $100 deposit match when you sign up. So with that, Derek, we finally have some answers to a lot of the lingering questions with the Indianapolis Colts, and a lot of answers to some questions, and some answers that we hoped we would get that we didn't get. And that leads to some other questions. And so I think overall, before we dive into the prospects, Derek, what was your overall impression of this draft? What surprised you the most for the Colts? What did you expect the most? Just talk to me about your overall thoughts here on the 2024 draft for Indy.
Maybe the most surprising draft that we have seen from Indy in the last couple of years, particularly just in the approach of Indy and how they went about this draft. Some of these players, not as much talent related as much more production wise, which is something that I know a lot of fans have been pounding the table for Ballard to be able to do, especially in some of the main positions like edge and offensive line and some of those other things where we wanted them to be able to get more guys that are more established in college rather than just getting the best athlete possible and hope that they develop, right? So that's kind of the situation that we found ourselves in. We've had a lot of guys here with some bad RAS scores or just not elite RAS scores in comparison even to last year where like the lowest RAS score was Josh Downs with a low 9, right? So it's kind of one of those situations where you're like, man, Indy went a little bit of a different route this time around. You could see the passion through this draft process that Ballard really had with that. We obviously saw from the presser that he had after day 2 when talking about Adonai Mitchell and these other players that, you know, go through these draft processes. So it definitely was an interesting draft that's going to take a lot to digest and kind of understand through a lot of research.
Yeah, and it, like you said, complete difference from a year ago. You know, the Colts still got their guys. Like, it wasn't a complete, like, deviation from the plan, right? The Colts still got a couple guys in the high 9s RAS, which we'll talk about. But, yeah, I think that's something that you said, Derek, that I think is key. And, honestly, I think what's needed for Chris Ballard, right, is the fact that, like, we've seen him in the past take guys with extremely high RAS scores, but not necessarily great production. It didn't match. And it felt like a lot more this time. The Colts kind of tried to find the best of both worlds. You know, they had a couple guys that had high RAS scores and also some high production as well. But then they had some guys with not as great RAS scores, but still equally high production as well. So definitely an interesting kind of deviation for Chris Ballard. And it seems like Derek, I know we talked about this briefly before off air, but like I've kind of had this thought, like Shane Steichen, has he been one of the best things for Chris Ballard and how he has changed his approach when it comes to the draft, where it doesn't always have to be about these physical freaks. Well, obviously, there's a lot of positives in drafting these guys. It doesn't have to always be that, you know, for the Indianapolis Colts at every single pick in the draft. And so for me, yeah, it made a lot of sense for the Colts to kind of deviate. And I think you saw it right away, Derek, with the Indianapolis Colts' first pick overall. 15th overall for the Indianapolis Colts. They would say the best defensive player in the draft, Laiatu Latu out of UCLA. We've talked about this pick ad nauseum at this point, Derek. Initially, we were surprised because guys like Dallas Turner and some other guys were there on the board. And really the Colts, if you look at it this way, they got the number 1 overall pick on defense. Yep. They had their choice to pick any single defender they wanted in this draft. Yep. And they felt like Latu was the number 1 defender. And when you look at just some of the stats over the last couple of years for Latu, I mean, the stats back it up. I mean, he's been one of the best guys at getting after the passer, but not just that, just one of the best defensive players in the country when it comes to sacks, quarterback hits, pressure rates, tackles for loss, everything he checks off. And also his character, like we've seen his character already shine through in some of the interviews, his character is off the charts. I mean, it was so much off the charts for the Colts, they didn't feel like they needed to even interview him.
Right.
You know, really have a top 30 visit type of thing with him because they already knew his character, right? And so that was definitely interesting. Obviously, they talked to him in the pre-draft process a little bit. They didn't have that formal sit-down visit because they felt like he is such a clean prospect. Like, if he's there, we're taking him, you know? And obviously, the rest is history there. I know there was obviously the concerns about the medical stuff. Seems like those concerns have kind of died down a little bit after you've kind of heard from Latu and you've kind of heard from the Colts and Chris Ballard about that, whole thing with the neck. Again, that was almost 3 years ago at this point where that whole thing happened. And, since then he's played a year of rugby, played 2 full years of college football at an extremely high level. So that makes you feel confident that, if the Colts are comfortable with it, they're not a team that just throws out the medicals. They're a team that definitely that is a factor for them. So if they feel comfortable with it, I feel comfortable with it. I think a lot of fans have started to come around to it. But, I mean, Latu on paper, Derek, he is a guy that is definitely has the potential to be, number one, the alpha, and number two, just a difference maker on this defense.
Yeah, and I'll say real quick before getting into Latu, I think this draft in particular also kind of shows the hand of what Indianapolis is trying to or is going to need to accomplish in free agency still. You could see the direction in which they were trying to go with this draft. And I think that by all accounts, I think most people know either Indy is going to be accepting what the secondary is now, or they're going to still try to work to do more in it through free agency based off what we saw. And that was obviously adamant when you took Latu here at 15 versus you had any corner that you wanted. Mm-hmm. Every corner was available, even Terry and Arnold, who most people had as the number one corner in this draft class. And I think he wasn't actually the number one corner that was taken. It was actually Quinyon Mitchell, if I'm not mistaken, at 22 with the Philadelphia Eagles. So it took a while for some of these corners to actually get taken off the board. And, people are asking, is Latu the best defensive player that was out there in this draft? Well, if you asked anyone on the first night what they thought of Latu, the only people that didn't have raving things to say about it was just the Colts fans that didn't like the fact that, we took a defensive end at 15 overall. Everyone else will tell you the exact same thing. Maybe not quite the athlete that some of the other guys that we have taken before him were, but this guy is a much more productive player than any defensive lineman that we have taken coming out of college ever. Other than a couple other guys from a long time ago in the Ballard era, there has never been a defensive lineman he has taken that has been as productive and as efficient at their job as Latu was in this spot. So a lot of people are extremely excited to get him in the building. I know I'm excited for him to be in the building, and it is going to be a lot of fun to see what Charlie Partridge and that group can do with Latu over there, because he's already got familiarity with Kwity Paye, and he's already talking about, helping him out with things in Indy. So it's definitely going to be fun to see him and what he can do.
Yeah, and Latu, I think we've talked about this before, but I'll mention it again. He's a guy that, yes, he still had a really good RAS score, a 9.3 plus. So he's still a very athletic guy, no doubt about that. But he also has some stuff in there that RAS doesn't necessarily catch, right? He has the smarts. He has some of that stuff that physically it won't show up, but he has that, and also the production, like you mentioned, 13 sacks a season ago. I believe he's had, between the last 2 seasons, the most sacks in college football and the most tackles for loss in college football. So he has been everywhere when he's been on the field for USC or for UCLA. And so definitely a great pick there for the Indianapolis Colts and Laiatu at pick 15. And you've heard from different people, people who have studied Latu, even players. So Max Crosby raving about Latu and what he's able to do with the Indianapolis Colts. And so you think, man, you mentioned with getting in with Charlie Partridge, how much better can he even become now? he's one of the most polished players we've seen coming out of the draft when it comes to getting after the passer. And so you just wonder with Charlie Partridge, Latu said he has 3 different moves he goes to, which is amazing because how many guys only have one? How many pass rushers only have one move they do? Latu has 3 different ways he can change it up. So how much better will now Charlie Partridge be able to help him even refine his craft more, which is definitely exciting because he's very polished already. So how much better can he actually get? So that's great. So let's move on to round number 2 there, Derek, for the Indianapolis Colts. Yes, very surprising because we didn't think character-wise what was reported, right? We didn't think this guy would be on the Colts' radar. Certainly didn't think he'd be available when Indianapolis drafted. Obviously, Indianapolis traded out of 46, went all the way down, I believe, pick 52.
Yep. And
they were able to snag, we would say, one of the best wide receivers in this class, wide receiver out of Texas, Adonai Mitchell. And Derek, he's 6'4". I've seen anywhere from 6'2" to 6'4". So I'm going to say
6'3".
We'll say 6'3".
Is about
we'll
that,
say 6'3",
right?
205, and a guy that a lot of people projected as a first-round pick. And Derek, when I kind of did my mock draft, when the scenario was my 3.0, when we did the trade down, I had the Colts selecting Adonai Mitchell, not in the second round, but in the first round.
Right.
Because I believe he is such an elite talent. I mean, what is it, 9.98 RAS score? So this dude is an athlete amongst all athletes. You talk about RAS Colts, he fits the bill there, but he's also productive. He had 55 catches with Texas this last year, and 11 of those were touchdowns. So literally every 5 catches were a touchdown. He's a big play waiting to happen, and you really do feel like he fits so well into what the Colts do offensively. And he's just such a weapon and such a guy that is so explosive. And Derek, when you get the ball in his hands, he can make a play.
Oh, 100%. And I mean, it was the most shocking one of the entire draft because, like you said, no one in the Colts circle, as fans in general, thought that Adonai Mitchell, even the media didn't think so. I mean, Adonai Mitchell, as you said, was a late first, early second. Like, the Colts would have either had to trade back into the 20s and might still not be able to get him at that moment, or they would have had to trade all the way up into the early second and still might not have had the chance to actually get him. So there was virtually no chance of Indy being able to snag him at 46. But then we saw him dropping. We saw him dropping and dropping and dropping. And that second round was going exactly how we wanted it to go if you were someone that wanted Adonai Mitchell on the Indianapolis Colts. They even traded down 6 picks, and still Adonai Mitchell was there at 52. And it made all the sense in the freaking world. I mean, again, this is a guy that can do everything. I mean, he is the perfect combination of what every wide receiver on the Indianapolis Colts is. And if you put them all together in one guy, a guy that can catch in the intermediary and the short game, a guy that can get yards after the catch, the guy that can burn you down the field with Alec Pierce, and then Josh Downs, a guy that can create separation. That's one of those situations where we're like, man, what happened with this guy? Now, of course, when it comes to what were the concerns with Adonai Mitchell, well, the big thing was everybody was talking about, hey, like we're wondering what kind of character issues was this guy having? That was the big concern with Adonai Mitchell was, this guy takes plays off, or he doesn't like to go 100% all in it, or he doesn't have his heart completely in the game, or, and we heard from Rappaport that he interviewed badly. And that's why a bunch of teams just didn't really like the feel Adonai Mitchell. And that resulted in, Chris Ballard going on one of the most epic rants of a GM ever and couldn't even hold himself together to stop cursing at just how bad Adonai Mitchell got his name thrown around by anonymous people saying these certain things. Now, obviously, there has to be something that was going on for all these teams to want to throw their name out of the sweepstakes for Adonai Mitchell. Maybe they just thought that it just wasn't worth the hassle. But of course, Indianapolis did not seem to think that was as much of an issue for them. They thought what this guy can become and how great our locker room is with Shane Steichen at the helm, Reggie Wayne as the wide receiver coach, and some of these guys in the locker room who are not, some of them who are not only young guys, but a guy like Michael Pittman who has his head together, is getting paid, knows what it takes to exceed at this level. You have every basis covered to bring a potential risk in someone like that into your locker room and say, we're going to whip this guy into shape. And if this guy does actually want to commit to the game, then you might have just found a steal of the whole draft. I mean, completely honest with you.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And you mentioned it. You have every different type of receiver too. You have Michael Pittman, who's that possession guy. He's been here for a little while, so he's got a feel. He's that veteran of the room. You have Josh Downs, who obviously the Colts extremely high on last year when they took him in round 3. You have these different guys, Alec Pierce, who does a little bit down the field. And so you add a guy in Adonai Mitchell now where you're like, man, you got weapons galore for Anthony Richardson and Shane Steichen to work with. Mm-hmm. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, like if Adonai Mitchell reaches his full potential is one of the best receivers in this draft. I really do believe that. So definitely great that Indianapolis was able to get him. Obviously, Mitchell was pretty upset, initially. And I don't know if it was
why.
Yeah, he didn't say why. I don't know if it was because he fell or because of some of the rumors going on. It could be a combination of everything.
Yeah, I'm sure that there was probably, again, and that's one of the things that, like, maybe he got told by somebody that he was going somewhere, and then a certain story started coming out that was not something that he liked, and it ended up dropping him. And then somebody probably started spewing some stuff to some of these GMs that were maybe considering Adonai Mitchell, and that's why he kept falling. Maybe that's exactly why. I mean,
could be.
We'll never know unless he actually specifically says it, but we have a feeling it just had something to do with, why he was falling. And, but I mean, if it ends up not being true and he fell into the lap of the Indianapolis Colts at 52, I mean, again, you couldn't have asked for a better opportunity for that.
Absolutely. So that was definitely a pick that we were surprised at, but very excited when he did fall to Indianapolis and they were able to take him there in the second round. And so we were very stoked for the first 2 picks because that is exactly what you were hoping for. 2 guys that you could argue, I mean, Latu not so much, but with Adonai Mitchell, he's right in the conversation there, I think, for a top 5 player at the position in a very deep wide receiver class when he fully is there. The talent is certainly there. But so that's how the Colts handled the first 2 rounds. And then when we moved to round number 3, we were a little bit surprised initially, but the Indianapolis Colts went to their offensive line and they took offensive tackle / guard Matt Goncalves. So offensive tackle out of Pitt. I'll remind you, Charlie Partridge, the new defensive line coach, was at Pitt last year. So he got to see a lot of Goncalves when they were, going up against each other in practice. Definitely was a big advocate for Goncalves and Indianapolis and Chris Ballard. They weren't shy about their love for this guy.
Yeah.
He had that injury, that he suffered in the season. And so that kind of caused him to drop here to pick 79. But Indianapolis definitely felt like they got a really good offensive lineman. They said even Joe Wall, being in that class, they said he was one of our favorites in this class. Mm-hmm. And so that definitely is a good thing for Indianapolis because when you think about it, Goncalves, it was interesting because you look at it, he had 2 different RAS scores. He had 1 for tackle and 1 for guard. And I think this is a reason why a lot of people think he might be a better guard than tackle in the NFL is because he's a massive human, right? He's 330 pounds, so he is huge.
6'6".
6'6", 320, 330, somewhere around that range. And he's definitely a guy that thrives in pass protection especially. Needs a little more work in terms of run blocking, but, you think, hey, he's only going to get better with that in working with Tony Sperano Jr., but definitely a guy, Derek, that I think was important to have, kind of a guy that could potentially step in to right guard, could compete with Will Fries for that right guard position, potentially even win that here his rookie season, or he could be a swing tackle. He played both left and right at Pitt. Mm-hmm. Didn't really play a lot of guard, but I feel like he could probably play pretty much any position. I mean, Chris Ballard didn't even rule out center for him. So feels like he could play about any position for you, which is definitely valuable to have a very position flexible type of guy here in Goncalves that you think can really help you out in a pinch. And Derek, we know how important and how crucial it is in the immediate to have that type of depth on your O-line, especially last year. You're in a situation last year, Derek, where you had two of your tackles missing a couple games.
Yeah.
Right? You had obviously Braden Smith, his worst career year in terms of injuries. You had multiple injuries. That knee was just bothering him about all year. And then you had Bernard Ryman, who missed, I think, 1 or 2 games with that concussion. I think it was 2 games. And so the need for tackle is so, so critical. And even just pushing Will Fries, I think, is definitely important. Not just handing him that position, that starting position, which I think the Colts kind of did that last year. Now, fortunately, it worked out in the end of everything, and he actually played pretty serviceable. But again, could you afford to upgrade? Yes, you could. You could go from a serviceable guy to a guy that could be one of the better offensive linemen in the NFL, right? Like, that is the potential of a guy the Colts feel like with Goncalves here, if he is indeed able to, convert into a guard and more play that position in the immediate. Or if you look at it in another way, in the future, Braden Smith's in a contract year. So Could this potentially be a move for the future for that? Potentially trying to figure out right tackle, not wanting to pay Braden Smith all that money. That's a possibility as well. But what are your thoughts on the Indianapolis Colts here in round 3 going to their O-line?
Yeah, it was definitely the first pick that you and I were basically kind of shocked with. Just, it was not the direction in which we thought Indianapolis was going to be headed there. We most likely thought secondary was what was going to end up being the next pick for us here. But we both thought about it and we're like, wow, okay, so definitely interesting. But when you start to dive deeper into Goncalves, it makes a lot more sense. I mean, what a serviceable dude to have for a swing tackle or to be able to work onto the inside. I mean, just to have a guy that can do it all for you is such a huge thing. And like you said, the offensive line that we have coming up for this team, I mean, Kelly's not going to be here for much longer.
Maybe
not. Will Fries, could potentially not be here for very long. And Braden Smith is always dealing with injuries of some kind. So, Goncalves comes into a situation where he definitely can be serviceable. And we're going to talk about the next pick here in a minute. That's also an O-lineman. But, I mean, what's not to love about this guy? A huge player, a great pass protector, only allowed 3 pressures in over 900 snaps at Pittsburgh. So, I mean, a great, fantastic player. And like you said, one guy that it was the first guy that we were like, RAS score doesn't match what we typically see from a Ballard offensive lineman. But regardless, this is a guy that's been well established that he is a pass protector. He's a bully. He's a big boy. And that's what you wanted in someone that could do that. And then, of course, when you hear the phone call that he got from Chris Ballard, it just affirmed the fact that he was so happy to be going to Indianapolis. And, he knows that Charlie Partridge is there. He has that connection with a coach. It's always great when you have a connection with someone when you're going to a new place and knowing someone in the building, even if you're never going to be on the same field with them at any given moment when it comes to playing, still to be in the building, to be able to talk to that said person, it's always a great thing to have. And he was insanely happy to be an Indianapolis Colt. It's one of those videos that almost brings a tear to your eye. It makes you laugh whenever you're listening to it, to hear him and his family's reaction. So it's awesome. Yeah, it's awesome. It's great that Indy has it as not only as a backup plan for this year, but a potential future backup plan looking towards the future, which you got to be able to do sometimes.
Absolutely. And speaking of that, in round number 4 for the Indianapolis Colts, pick 117, the Colts again addressed their offensive line. They went back to their interior offensive line, and they took center out of Wisconsin, Tanor Bortolini, and definitely was an interesting one here, Derek, because we know Ryan Kelly, I think I said Braden Smith, I meant Ryan Kelly, in a contract year this year, dealt with some injuries last year, had 2 concussions last year. Again, I know he's adamant he's not going to retire, but again, he's on the wrong side of 30. He's had injury history. I think this pick made a ton of sense for Indianapolis. And this is something we even talked about, Derek, just talking about like, hey, I think it would be wise for the Colts to consider the future of their center position. I think it'd be wise. And we know that really, realistically, Ryan Kelly's not going to probably play in all 17 games. He hasn't done that since I don't even know when. It's been a long time. He traditionally gets beat up in some way, and he has to miss a couple games.
Yeah.
And so that's just kind of how it's been. And so that's the reality of where you are. And while we like guys like Wesley French and we like the re-signing of Danny Pinter, let's be honest, none of those guys are going to be those type of guys that you really, truly feel like are going to be the long-term solution at center. Like, none of those guys are.
Mm-hmm.
You would feel not great with that. And so insert Bortolini here, one of the most athletic, I think he's the most athletic center that we've seen since like 2003. And so he's, he's about 300 pounds, so he could get a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger. I think that's kind of his biggest thing.
Yeah.
But we've seen the Colts do this, Derek, with a guy like Bernhard Raimann a couple years ago in the third round. So very similar to this, right? And even Blake Freeland last year. The athletic traits, they're there, right?
Mm-hmm.
The issue is some of that strength. And that is exactly how it fits so well with what the Colts want to do, right? Because we saw what they did with Bernhard Raimann. We saw the change from year 1 to year 2 in him. I mean, he put 10 to 15 pounds of muscle on, and he was able to handle a lot more of those, really power rushers, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think on the surface, Bortolini, he might have some trouble with the power rushers immediately. But the good news is he's not going to be, hopefully, thrown into the fire like Bernhard Raimann was.
Yeah.
Where literally the Colts didn't have a choice.
They didn't have a choice. Yeah.
So he's going to have a year to kind of sit behind Ryan Kelly, fill in potentially when needed, be a spot starter type of player, and kind of show the Colts, do we feel confident enough, to potentially not extend Ryan Kelly next year and have him be our future guy? I think if he, honestly, Derek, this next offseason does something similar to Bernhard Raimann, I think there's a really good chance here because the athleticism, no doubt. But if he can get a little bit bigger and a little bit stronger, I truly believe he can be that center of the future for the Colts. So now we've seen the Colts restack the cupboard when it comes to the offensive line for depth in the immediate, but potential starters in the future.
Oh, 100%. And, give the credit to the Indianapolis Colts over the last several years of drafting guys who have, been really great players coming in, Braden Smith, Quentin Nelson, Ryan Kelly, all guys that have really excelled at their positions. But, I mean, take also privilege in some of the guys that have taken a chance from the Colts at offensive line. I mean, Will Fries, a 7th-round player, and was kind of thrown into the fire also because, again, right guard, we didn't really have much of a choice there either. But Will Fries was the best solution that you had at that time, and albeit has never really been a great offensive guard, but he's been far from a liability and has been able to hold his own plenty of times. So we've always liked to say, he's basically your average NFL guard. And if your worst offensive lineman is an average NFL guard, then you're doing really well at an offensive line to protect Anthony Richardson. So that's been great, and who knows what's going to happen with him after this year when he needs to get a contract extension. We'll see what happens there. And Bernhard Raimann as well. You said it. He wasn't big when he came out. And
he was around that 300 pounds.
He was around that 300
so right around
range.
the same.
This was a guy that was a tight end, too, in college half the time. He only ever had one real year at left tackle, so he was still so new to the position. But, again, taking what Will Fries and Bernhard Raimann have been able to do with the strength and conditioning, getting bigger, getting stronger, and being able to just hone their bodies so well and be able to and they've been the most dependable guys on the offensive line too. So, I mean, again, it's not out of the realm of possibility. I feel so good about any offensive lineman that Indy drafts, even if they're guys that won't start right away, that I feel confident in our strength and conditioning staff to get these guys into a space where they become better at that, because we've seen it happen time and time again. So, yeah, Tanor is definitely a smart player. Wisconsin mold. We know Indianapolis loves some boys from Wisconsin, just like at Notre Dame. I mean, Wisconsin developed some really great offensive linemen. And if you're smart and you interview well, you're athletic, and you're willing to commit yourself to the game, then you're gonna always be on Chris Ballard's radar. So I like the pick, man. I mean, a lot of people thought he could have been taken in day 2. So, I mean, I love it.
As we said, guys, today's episode is sponsored by Prize Picks. Now, what is Prize Picks? Prize Picks is the largest daily fantasy sports platform in North America. Instead of battling against thousands of other players across platforms, you're basically picking 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you're choosing more or less on those stat projections to be able to watch those winnings roll in. It's very easy. Do you guys want to play along at some of Prize Picks' favorite players like rapper Meek Mill and UFC fighter Sugar Sean O'Malley? Well, if you guys sign up today, you can find the community plays under the promos tab of the app to view the entries of some of the biggest names on the platform and be a part of that as well. You can now win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000 just like that with NBA, NHL, and college basketball entries today on Prize Picks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. Like a lot of other things, guys, they also offer injury insurance, so your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. So if someone exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player projection won't count against you and the rest of your entry stays live. So it's great bounce back for that one. What I love about the app as well, guys, is it's not just sports like NBA, NHL, football, and tennis, and baseball, and all these other things, but there's also a lot of others that go into it as well. If you like to place entries on video game situations like Call of Duty, CS2, Apex, if that's something that appeals to you, there's a wide variety of sports and video games and everything else that you can place entries on. And I love how expansive it is. Even just looking at the NBA, there's entries you can make with turnovers, with points. You can do combo deals, dunks, field goals attempted, all of these different things. So there's just so many different ways to make money off of these entries. Be sure to download the app today and use code BTJ for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, download the app today and use code BTJ for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, it's sponsored by Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy.
Absolutely. Well, talk about double dipping in the offensive line interior. The Colts also double dipped at wide receiver in the 5th round. The Indianapolis Colts at pick 142. Again, this is the first of their 3 picks. They took wide receiver Anthony Gould out of Oregon State. I don't know if it's Gould or Gold, so I apologize. Okay, Anthony Gould out of Oregon State. But regardless of how you pronounce it, Anthony Gould, Derek, I mean, outside of his size, which he's small, right? He's 5'8", 175 pounds. So very small receiver. But everything else, every other indication, Derek, would have you believe that Anthony Gould is an elite prospect when it comes to the RAS score, right? He is a guy that has elite speed, elite explosiveness. He's got pretty much everything you're looking for. That's either really good or elite. And obviously we saw what he did in the East-West Shrine Bowl, where he had a couple punt returns for touchdowns, and he was just absolutely electric. And then what he did even just at his time with Oregon State as a receiver, Yep. He was a guy, we watched some highlights of him, and he's just a guy that, despite poor quarterback play at times, where the ball, you're like, that was a terrible throw, he still was able to have some really good ball tracking skills, especially for his size, and also just going up and getting balls, right? Going up and getting contested catches, right? So for being 5'8", I definitely felt like he was a guy that plays bigger than he is. I really do feel like that. Because you look at him, you're like, wow, that's a small dude. But he's up there making contested catches against corners that are much bigger than him. So definitely love him. Now the immediate impact for Anthony Gould, Derek, I think you got to talk about just the return department for him.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the best returners in college football over the last couple seasons. And just, I think immediately as a special teams guy that you can throw in there and say, hey, we don't want to have Josh Downs returning punts and kicks anymore. We don't want to have even Dallas Flowers doing that because, number one, the injury, but number two, he might be your number 2 starting corner. He's going to probably get some decent playing time regardless of where it shakes out there. So I do feel like for the Indianapolis Colts, this is a pick that makes a lot of sense. And he's not just a one-trick pony. Like, he's not just a returner and never will have any potential at wide receiver.
Yeah.
He's got that potential at wide receiver because he is very explosive, and that's something Ballard wanted to add. We already got explosion with Adonai Mitchell, so you just add even more explosion with a guy like Anthony Gould. Tell me about it.
I think he fills that Isaiah McKenzie role very well here. Best return guy in the entire college football landscape over the last 2 years. In his second year as a Oregon State guy, he had over 18 yards per return. Even this last year, over 16 and a half yards per return. So whenever this guy was returning punts or kick returns, this guy was electric. And that's what you need because we know Indianapolis is always looking for better special teams guys. It matters more for Indianapolis than a lot of other teams out there. And you're right. This is the kind of guy, he's not going to get a lot of snaps on the offense, but with the way the offense is set up, though, he will be able to get a couple of opportunities in this scheme. So just with his athletic ability, his speed and explosiveness, and just how shifty he is, no doubt that there's going to be a couple sweeps thrown his way, a couple screens thrown his way, maybe an occasional deep ball thrown his way because he has that speed, 4.39 40 times. So I think this could definitely be the next Isaiah McKenzie here. He takes over the return duties, which is exactly the role that he should be given. And that's where that size really doesn't hurt you at all. If anything, that actually makes it better for you because it's less surface area for people to grab you. So he's actually smaller in most ways than Josh Downs, which is actually pretty crazy to think about. So, I mean, it's a great pick. In the 5th round, you can get the best return man in college football who has the occasional offensive output that you can throw in there. I'm not going to be mad about it.
So that was the first of the 5th rounders. Now there's another 5th rounder. The Colts had their second of 3, and with their second of 3 and pick 151, the Colts took Jaylon Carlies out of Missouri. And I almost said safety, but he's listed as linebacker here. And it's kind of interesting, Derek, because I think it's pretty well known now. The Colts kind of made it known he's going to be a linebacker. He played more safety at Missouri, but definitely a guy, Derek, for the Indianapolis Colts that makes a lot of sense here. I mean, we knew and we kind of felt like linebacker was some sort of need here on day number 3. I mean, you get a guy in Carlies here that definitely is a guy that has some potential, right? I mean, RAS score is nothing that's going to blow you away, but you do wonder how many of those things that he was graded as a free safety, right? Yeah. So how many of those traits that maybe weren't as great when you translate those to linebackers, maybe those go up a whole lot, So definitely a guy that you love. And I know Cato June loves it as a player that was a former safety that converted to linebacker. And we know how that worked out. But just get another athletic guy here for the Indianapolis Colts, rounding out that linebacker room, adding a little bit of depth, a little bit of competition in there. I definitely had no issues with the Colts going there in round number 5 and just solidifying the depth there at linebacker.
And this would be another special teams guy here as well, because the way this guy plays, I mean, he legitimately could light somebody up and could destroy people.
We saw him doing that.
Yeah, his highlights are insane. The way he tackles and the way he hits people, I mean, my goodness, he applies the pop. And that's definitely going to be something, I'm sure that is what put him on notice with the Indianapolis Colts. I mean, they love that physicality, and that definitely is what pops out here for Jaylon. So it'll be interesting to see what his kind of role will be. Like you said, he's going to be a guy that's going to move to a linebacker because he's just a little too big for the free safety spot right now. And, we have some other guys there that we really want to try to work on. But outside of, Zaire Franklin and EJ Speed, that third linebacker spot, it's really up for grabs, and there's a lot of potential opportunities there for special teams. And, he'll work with a couple other guys as well that we have. So it's going to be interesting. But I do believe this is going to be a guy that for special teams, he's going to be one of your guys that you're really going to enjoy watching on coverage teams this year.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how Indy uses him because you kind of saw Missouri use him all over the field on defense. So really intrigued to see how Indy uses him there. Definitely a guy that has a nose for the ball, no question about it. Not afraid to come up and lay a hit on someone. All right, well, the final pick for the Indianapolis Colts here in round number 5. Now, again, the Colts did trade back here with the Philadelphia Eagles. They originally had that 155th overall, but they traded down 9 picks to 164 and also received the 6th-round pick, 201 overall. And with that 165th overall pick, the Indianapolis Colts added another Jaylin. They added this time Jaylin Simpson out of Auburn. And this is the guy that's going to play safety, Derek. He's not going to convert to something else. He is going to play some sort of position, either free safety or corner. And there's been some questions on that. I think he has said that the Indianapolis Colts said they like him more at free safety, but again, we'll see on that. You know, they could try him out at a couple different positions, but they're not the most athletic guy in the world. But when you look at Jaylin Simpson, I mean, especially at free safety, he is a guy that definitely has a nose for the ball. He's a ball hawk. He has some traits there in terms of speed that you really, really like, and explosion. While he maybe will lack some things when it comes to, his size, because he's a little bit undersized. He's, 5'11", 190, somewhere around there. So 185, somewhere around there. So he's not the biggest free safety in the world. But again, he's a guy that had 4 interceptions in college last year at Auburn. And he's a guy that just kind of has a nose for the ball here. So definitely a big fan here of the Indianapolis Colts, adding more competition into that free safety room if that's what he plays, and having him compete, for that starting free safety position. I think he has a chance, Derek, to potentially win that spot. So
definitely an explosively fast guy that has a knack for creating a turnover. So very interesting pick there. We'll see where he actually ends up in that secondary, but it'll definitely be fun, again, to see who that ends up being for them. So
yeah, well, I guess we'll have to see how that works out for them.
Yep.
But I mentioned the Colts acquired a 6th-round pick 201, and they actually addressed corner here, Derek, but they took a guy that I think we were shocked because he's not on paper the most athletic guy, but when you look at his stats and his production, there's no doubt that Micah Abraham out of Marshall, he definitely potentially has some dog in him, Derek. I mean, he is a guy over the last 2 years at Marshall, 10 interceptions. He had 6 in 2023, or 6 in 2022, 4 in 2023. So no doubt this guy has a nose for the ball, and he knows how to make some big plays. Now, again, as we have with every single player that's from a smaller type of school, the question has to be the level of competition. There's no doubt about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, 'cause he's not doing it against really anybody of note when it comes to that.
Mm-hmm.
But again, this guy's a playmaker. He showed it in college. And I mean, 6 interceptions in the season, that's pretty impressive. So, and 10 over the last 2 seasons, that's really impressive as well. So maybe not the traditional Ballard pick. I think this is a very anti-Ballard pick from what we've talked about in the past.
Yeah.
Again, we've talked about this is a different approach the Colts have had going back to that production, right? But he produced in college, which I think is the most important thing here.
Yeah, absolutely. And the big thing with it is he's definitely going to probably remain as a slot corner.
It's a 5'9", right?
Because, 5'9", so he's very small, kind of that same thing as Kenny Moore, right? I mean, Kenny Moore had that same thing coming out of college. But it's funny because if you had looked at this guy's numbers over the last 2 years, you would have never thought that this was a guy that, would be going all the way to the 6th round. Now, obviously, the size and the lack of any extreme physical attributes is what has dropped him all the way down. Like you said, the level of competition, it is what it is. But Abraham, again, like you said, 10 interceptions over the last 2 years. In 2023, had 15 pass deflections, which would have been the 3rd most of any corner in all of the FBS last year. So, again, regardless of the competition he was facing, he was dominating. And that was one of those players where the production or the athletic score did not match the production. It's one of the few times that we have seen a complete 180 to what we normally see Ballard do. Normally go with the traits, but don't have much of any production. Now, we had another time where this guy has a lot of production and a lot of experience, but doesn't have a lot of the athletic traits. So you had to have that kind of dog in you if the Colts were willing to consider you with that bad of an RAS score. They had to have seen something in you that told them this guy can battle it out with the rest of them. So this one will be one of the most interesting ones to follow throughout this offseason on whether or not he actually makes this roster, because, again, the production is there. He plays hard. It'll be interesting to see what he actually does.
Yeah, I mean, the tape must have just exploded to the Indianapolis Colts. For them to take a player like that is not even close to how they typically take players. I mean, that production, that just had in that tape, that must have just stood out to them for them to take a guy like this, despite some of the things that have honestly been against some of their philosophies in certain ways when it comes to roster building and drafting. So definitely will be interesting there. But yeah, he's very intriguing. I don't really know how to feel about it. I think you look at the production and you're like, hey, it's good that he dominated there, but how does he respond at the next level?
Yep.
But the last pick the Indianapolis Colts had in round number 7, I want to talk about this one. Pick 234, the Indianapolis Colts took Jonah Laulu out of Oklahoma. Now, a guy that I think played a little bit more defensive line. It was kind of like up for debate. He could play a couple different positions. He could play 1 tech. He could play 3 tech. I think I'd probably pencil him in more 3 tech because he's a tad bit undersized when it comes to weight. He's like 290. I mean, that's not that bad. I think at 3 tech, that's a little bit better. That makes you feel a little bit better. I mean, DeForest Buckner's not that much heavier than him. But, I mean, he's got a lot of physical traits you like, Derek. And this was like, okay, Chris Ballard's back. You know, he just had a very anti-Chris Ballard type of pick. And this is a very Chris Ballard type of pick. You know, over a 9 RAS score. So this is a guy that you really think potentially could come in and maybe even compete for that 3 tech position behind DeForest Buckner. And we'll see on that because obviously the Colts re-signed Taven Bryan. So could he be a guy that could kick a guy like Taven Bryan off the roster? We'll have to see about that. Yeah. But guys, that is the Indianapolis Colts draft in a nutshell. So I'll reread the picks really quickly before we wrap this up. And Derek, maybe we can mention as well, you mentioned it at the beginning, but what does this mean then for some of these other positions, right?
Yep.
So I'll read it one more time for you. So round 1, Laiatu Latu. Round 2, Adonai Mitchell. Round 3, Matt Goncalves. Round 4, Tanor Bortolini. Round 5, Anthony Gould. And round 5, Jaylon Carlies. Round 5, Jaylin Simpson. Round 6, Micah Abraham. And then round 7, Jonah Laulu out of Oklahoma. So before we wrap this thing up, Derek, and tie a nice little bow on it for the 2024 NFL draft, we have to ask the question in the room. What does this mean for the secondary? Because the Indianapolis Colts, while they did address it, they waited until day 3. Now, they did, to be fair, address it 2 times in a row in rounds 5 and 6.
Yep.
But they didn't really address it with a major amount of draft capital. So what does that mean to you when looking at this potential corner/safety market out for the Indianapolis Colts?
I really wonder if it means anything for the cornerback room specifically. Now, safety, I have been on the record several times insinuating that the Indianapolis Colts will be taking a safety at some point along this process because, again, you moved all that money in that cap space with the DeForest Buckner extension. Even after these draft picks that you're about to sign, most likely having around $15 million to work with. So if you're Indianapolis and you're sitting there with that kind of money and you have the opportunity to sign a safety to round out what you're trying to do, because again, he's talked about continuity with the group, and I totally understand that. And I think that he's truly following that concept. And I don't know if he really thinks the cornerback room specifically needs a veteran of that caliber and that kind of money in that room. Now, safety room, that could be a different story because we're still looking at there's a lot of things that need to be done for that safety room. And that's where there's a lot of guys still available there at that spot that you can make a good move on. But it will be interesting to see what they do with it throughout the remainder of this offseason.
And we've heard the Indianapolis Colts have interest in 2 of those safeties. Obviously, Justin Simmons being one of those who I think we would definitely love. A guy that's an all-pro type of player when he's on the field. And then you obviously have Quandre Diggs as well. So 2 quality options at safety if the Colts wanted to go that route. But guys, it'll be interesting to see what the follow-up here is for the Indianapolis Colts, especially in the secondary. Do they address it at all? And if they do, to what capacity? But guys, that'll do it for the 2024 NFL Draft. Like we said, it was a full weekend for us. We are exhausted, but we wanted to drop this recap for you all and let you know, hey, this is how the NFL Draft went for the Indianapolis Colts. I think we're pretty happy with it. Overall, we'll have some other things like draft grades and stuff like that later on, but just wanted to drop a recap here for you guys. But guys, let us know your thoughts on the 2024 NFL Draft for the Indianapolis Colts. Curious to hear your thoughts. That'll do it for this one, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. We greatly appreciate it. And as always, guys, go Colts.